Annual Adler Lecture at the Coeur d'Alene Public Library. I'm David Townsend, Communications Coordinator for the library. Dr. Adler's in-person lecture was scheduled for earlier this month and was postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the closure of the library. We are pleased to be able to now share this online lecture with you. It is simultaneously streaming on CdA-TV, Spectrum Channel 1301, on the YouTube channel for the City of Coeur d'Alene, and the Facebook pages for the library and the city. Viewers are invited to submit questions using the comments on the library's Facebook page, facebook.com/CDA Library. The questions will be put to the speaker by Library Director Betty Ammon after he is finished speaking. And we ask that you submit questions and not statements. And please, let's keep the dialogue civil. This lecture is sponsored by the Friends of the Coeur d'Alene Public Library, the Coeur d'Alene Press, and the Alturist Institute, as well as CdA-TV. Dr. Adler is president of the Alturist Institute, a nonprofit organization created to promote civic education and civil dialogue. He is speaking on executive powers and the congressional oversight in response to national emergencies. He has taught courses on the Constitution and the Supreme Court at all 3 universities in Idaho and has held the Andrus Professorship at Boise State University and the McClure Professorship at the University of Idaho, where he held a joint appointment in the College of Law and the Department of Political Science. Previously, he was a professor of political science and director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at Idaho State University. He remains a lecturer at the University of Idaho College of Law. A recipient of teaching, civic, and writing awards, Adler has published in the leading journals of his field and has lectured nationally and internationally on the Constitution, presidential power, and the Bill of Rights. He has delivered more than 600 public lectures throughout Idaho and writes frequent op-ed pieces for newspapers across the state. The author of more than 100 scholarly articles, essays, book chapters, and books, Adler has published widely on the Constitution and presidential power. His writings have been quoted and cited by the U.S. Supreme Court and lower federal courts, political scientists, historians, and legal scholars, and invoked by both Republican and Democrats in the legislative and executive branches of the federal government. He has consulted with members of Congress from both parties on a variety of constitutional issues, including impeachment, the war power, and treaty termination. A frequent commenter on state and national events, his lectures have aired on C-SPAN. He has done interviews with reporters from the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, National Review, The Nation magazine, and even Mother Jones. He has appeared on Fox News, NPR, NBC, CNN, and the BBC. He serves as a member of the board of directors for various academic, corporate, and civic organizations. He earned his bachelor's degree from Michigan State University and a doctorate from the University of Idaho. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Adler.
Good evening, and thank you very much, David and Betty. And I appreciate the opportunity to meet with all of you again in this new wonderful world made possible by Zoom and Facebook Live and other means of social media that allow us to continue our dialogue on important issues. I'm grateful to Friends of the Library and the Coeur d'Alene Press, my friend Mike Patrick there, and to others who have offered support for tonight's talk. I'm sorry that we're not meeting together, but I hope next year we'll all be able to gather once more in the beautiful library in Coeur d'Alene. My talk tonight deals with a subject that is certainly timely and somewhat controversial and even reflective of confusion here in Idaho and across the nation, as Americans have come to grips with the limitations imposed on some of their behavior and their movement, necessitated by the pandemic, as David indicated, which we call COVID-19. The reality is that for the past several months, Americans have begun to operate under new circumstances, new rules of behavior in an effort to try to defeat the coronavirus. And of course, as you all know, sadly, just today, we passed the dreaded 100,000 mark of deaths here in the United States. And so it's a very, very sad day. And we wonder, what can our government at all levels, local, county, state, and certainly national, do to combat the virus and to take us to a new state of perhaps renewed normalcy as we look to pharmaceutical companies and researchers to develop therapeutic means of dealing with the virus, and ultimately, and we hope sooner rather than later, a vaccine to treat the virus. So we're all in this together. The virus spares no one from coast to coast, and it knows no political colors. It doesn't know any ideology, conservative or liberal, and does not know political party, Republican or Democratic. And it certainly does not take anybody and treat them with favor. So we're in a public health crisis, and the question for us tonight is the question of the scope of governmental authority in the presidency, in Congress, and certainly at the state level as well, as it pertains to legislative and executive powers. And this talk allows us once more to probe some basic fundamentals about our constitutional jurisprudence, and to understand once more that while government certainly has no absolute authority, it is also true that citizens' rights are somewhat limited, somewhat restrained during times of emergency. So let's begin by noting that the subject of emergency governmental powers, or police powers, is not endemic to the United States. And indeed, emergency powers travel back in time, century after century, all the way at least to Roman law, where governmental authority to act in emergencies was extended and expanded so as to work on behalf of the public welfare. And that conception of an emergency governmental power obviously carried its way to England, the source of our laws and our conceptions of law and constitutionalism in many ways, and certainly the origin of our thinking about governmental power and individual rights during the English Civil War in the mid-17th century, and then the run-up in the American Revolution. In England, of course, it's familiar that the King of England enjoyed very, very broad authority in many ways when exercising the royal prerogative. The king enjoyed an absolute power, and that those assertions of an absolute prerogative in the mid-17th century helped to trigger the Civil Wars, a period of great constitutional crisis in England, pitting the source and the scope of monarchical authority against the emerging assertions of parliamentary authority and even individual rights. They were convulsive times, as the term Civil War suggests. That was a period that worked great influence on Americans' conception of constitutionalism and governmental power. And so it's worth our time to understand that during that period of time, there were great collisions between the assertion of executive versus legislative authority. When the king could claim an absolute emergency power, the question was, well, what will happen to parliamentary authority? What will happen to members of parliament in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords? And certainly what will happen to the people spread across England and its territory? Americans looked with interest at that period of time, a century later, certainly as they began to think deeply about the source of governmental power as they wrote state constitutions, ultimately our Constitution in 1787, and of course began to pen the Bill of Rights in 1789. In our system of government, it's important to note, the framers of the Constitution decided not to vest in the president emergency powers. The framers meeting in Philadelphia might well have opted to follow the very familiar path of prerogative powers exercised by the King of England, because after all, the easiest thing to do is to follow that which is familiar. But the framers well knew about the abuse of executive power, and particularly the abuses of the prerogative power by English kings, and they dared not travel that path. And so that raised the question about how to handle emergencies. Certainly the framers of our Constitution were not naive men. Indeed, they were men of considerable experience, serving in their own state legislature, some in the national legislature, some had been governors. They came from very successful backgrounds, and they were not so naive as to pretend that emergencies would never occur. And so that raised the question, would our government never have the authority to respond to an emergency? Must we suffer collapse because the authority to respond to an emergency was not, for example, vested in the newly minted presidency? On the contrary, the framers had vested sweeping authority in Congress to meet all emergencies, and certainly had in mind the idea, rooted in Roman law and asserted during English periods of influence on American thinking, of the doctrine known as retroactive ratification. How did this doctrine apply? What did it mean to those who founded our government? Let's take a look at that historical period. The first thing we want to note is that when the framers thought about emergency powers, they immediately understood those to be legislative powers. Legislative powers because laws are passed to respond to events in times of tranquility as well as times of emergency. And the laws governing the behavior of individuals and all other entities are necessarily passed by legislative bodies. So when the framers created Congress in 1787, it endowed Congress with sweeping powers, certainly far more power than that vested in the executive. It included, of course, the authority to pass laws. The lawmaking power enjoyed sweeping breadth in both scope and application. Moreover, Congress was given authority under Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 18 of the Constitution, known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, which allowed Congress to pass laws necessary to execute the powers vested in it by the Constitution. This provided ample room for Congress to determine the appropriate means to the ends supplied by the Constitution. And of course, there's no better example of responding to an emergency than the war power under the Constitution, which is vested in Congress, of course, under Article 1, Section 8, which grants to Congress the sole power to take the nation into war and to initiate hostilities. This means then that when the country feels seized by an emergency abroad that perhaps threatens American security, it is left to Congress alone to decide about the scope of that emergency and whether to initiate war or to, in fact, declare war on another country. In that same paragraph, Congress is given the authority ultimately to suspend the great writ of habeas corpus, the right that people enjoy when they're brought before, when they're arrested and brought before a magistrate. They have a right to have a court hear their case. Well, in some cases of an invasion, which would create an emergency, perhaps locally or of great national concern, it is Congress that has the authority to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in cases of insurrection and rebellion, for example. This means the framers decided that they would leave that authority to Congress, not the president, and understanding that the Great Writ, which was one of our fundamental rights, firmly grounded, for example, in Magna Carta in 1215 in England, endemic to all free nations, that the ultimate suspension of the Great Writ should be left to the determination of the people's representatives in Congress and not a single person in the Oval Office of the United States. These powers and others then represent the framers' concerns about the exercise of emergency power, and we can sum it up by saying that when confronted with an emergency, it is indeed left to the devices and the powers of Congress, with one exception. And that one exception, of course, is familiar to all of us, as found in the Commander-in-Chief Clause in Article 2 of the Constitution. Here, the President, on the occasion of an invasion of the United States, an attack on the United States, assumes the awesome responsibility of driving out the invaders. Once the invaders have been driven out, then the President refers the matter to Congress, and Congress decides what our next steps will be. And so in the gravest of all emergencies, when the nation is attacked by a foreign enemy, then the president is required to respond, and we hope to repel the invasion. But ladies and gentlemen, that's the only constitutionally based emergency power that the president enjoys. Any other emergency powers that the president of the United States might enjoy are granted to the president by virtue of statutory authority. This is important to understand because, as all of you know, over the past few weeks, President Donald Trump has asserted, quote, absolute authority to respond to the circumstances of the pandemic. He has, for example, asserted absolute authority to, quote, reopen the economy. He has more recently asserted authority to in effect, order churches to remain open, even if it meant acting in conflict with the orders of governors of various states. Here he said he had, quote, the authority to override governors and would not hesitate to exercise that power. So here, the question of the scope of a presidential emergency has been brought directly before us by some of President Trump's assertions. The first thing we would say about President Trump's recent assertions, of course, is that contrary to his statement, the President of the United States does not enjoy any absolute authority. No president in our history has ever asserted absolute authority because that would ring the changes on the assertion by the King of England of an absolute prerogative power, which, of course, the framers of our Constitution rightly rejected. The last thing the framers wanted to do was to establish monarchical power on American soil, and so they rejected the claim of executive power, the claim of absolute power vested in the president absolutely. Many years later, in 1952, Justice Robert Jackson wrote a concurring opinion in the steel seizure case, in which he explained the framers rejected the concept of placing an emergency power in the hands of the presidency because, he said, that would tend to kindle emergencies. Essentially, the thought was if the framers had given the president an emergency power, some presidents would find emergencies everywhere and would begin to assert very broad authority, perhaps not checked by the Constitution. So the framers rejected that, as Justice Jackson said. And as I say, no president in our history has ever asserted an absolute power. So that raises the question of what sources, what basis might be provided by the Trump administration when President Trump, for example, asserts the authority to, quote, reopen the economy or to override gubernatorial decisions to prevent churches from being reopened for their congregants to assemble. The short answer here is that the Trump administration has yet to identify any basis in the Constitution other than to say, as President Trump has said recently, that when someone is, and this I'm quoting here, when someone is president of the United States, the president enjoys the absolute authority, and then went on to explain that's necessarily the case, it's the right thing to do. We could spend a lot of time explaining once more in greater detail why the president was not given emergency powers, and certainly why the president was not given absolute authority. But it would be incumbent upon the president to cite a constitutional provision or two to provide the basis for that assertion. Lacking any constitutionally based authority, then, it would be the responsibility of the administration to cite a statutory source for these broad emergency powers, and certainly the assertion of an absolute authority. Nobody in the Trump administration has been able to cite a particular statute that would endow the president with absolute authority. That's wise, because there is none. But we actually can turn to statutes to see that the president is delegated very broad authority to respond to an emergency. And many Americans, for example, are well aware of the Defense Production Act of 1950. When President Trump, in very early March, declared a national emergency in connection with the pandemic, he was then free to invoke the Defense Production Act, passed by Congress, as the year suggests, in the very early years of the Cold War, in the context of the Korean War, designed to give the president the authority to issue directions and instructions to American factories so as to produce particular items, then in the name of spurring on either economic recovery or to spur the conduct of the war in Korea by producing, for example, more steel or whatever products or items the president thought necessary to promoting national security. And so thus, under the Defense Production Act, as it's been said many, many times across the country, President Trump might, in the early days of March, have invoked that statute, for example, to order various companies to produce protective masks or gowns. He might have invoked the Defense Production Act, moreover, to order companies to mass produce ventilators, so critical to treating patients who have contracted the COVID virus. He might have gone on to issue other directions and instructions to companies to engage in the mass production of tests, for example, to determine who might have the COVID virus. He didn't do any of those things, as you all know. And so what that really represents is, even though he has made broad claims, broad assertions to an absolute power to deal with the virus in various places, he's seldom invoked the Defense Production Act to this date. So most of his assertions have been intended to advance, I think, his policy views or perhaps some of his political goals. The long and short of it is that the president, lacking constitutional authority to respond to the pandemic, is entirely dependent upon statutory authority delegated by Congress to the president. The Supreme Court has upheld since the mid-1930s very broad acts of delegation by Congress to the president or to the executive branch in general, on the assumption that some actions might be better left, some decisions might be better left to members of the executive branch who have possession of more expertise or more individualized knowledge and experience in an area. And so Congress has freely delegated authority. At all events, that delegated authority in terms of constitutional principles are nonetheless confined because Congress is required to state a policy that is to be invoked and a standard that is to be met. So Congress from time to time has seen fit to pass statutes authorizing emergency action by the president, but it's important to remember once more that these are statutory, not constitutionally based powers. So since the president did not take the lead in early March in combating the COVID-19 virus, it meant, of course, that various state governors were left to step up, so to speak, to protect the health and welfare of their state residents. It's not a case that the states alone are the repository of powers to respond to a national pandemic. Indeed, Congress has broad authority to act in emergency. Congress, for example, could exercise its broad authority under the commerce power of Article 1 to regulate interstate commerce, or even in many, many cases to regulate intrastate commerce. Congress decided not to do this, but we understand that constitutionally speaking, the authority, as I say, to respond to the pandemic or to any public emergency is a shared opportunity for the exercise of leadership and powers to respond effectively to protect Americans. But because President Trump did not take the lead, and because Congress determined not to exercise its authority to limit travel, for example, from state to state, and with the exception of President Trump's decision to halt flights from China to the United States for the Chinese, as it happens, not Americans, because his very limited ban still permitted some 40,000 Americans who had been in China to return to the United States. With some exceptions, then, the fight against COVID-19 has been waged principally by states. Perhaps this is as it should be in our time, because states possess very broad police powers. Tonight we want to become acquainted, a little bit more acquainted, perhaps I should say, with the origin and scope of the police powers of a state, because they plumb the very depths of state power. The concept of state police powers, again, harkens back to English law and even to ancient Roman law, grounded in the understanding that one of the chief responsibilities, to many, the ultimate responsibility of government, is to protect the welfare of its citizenry. And this, once more, is truly grounded in legislative powers, because a government has authority to pass laws to meet the needs of the people. And in fact, the police power in America was explained very early on, and has certainly become cemented in this respect, as the authority of a state legislature to pass laws to promote the health and welfare of its citizens and its safety, the health, morals, welfare, and safety of its citizens. A very well-defined and familiar legal concept embraced across the centuries by state courts and by the Supreme Court and by treatise writers, among others. Let's think about what this means. The ultimate police power of a state, again, exercised and defined by the legislature in its lawmaking process, reaches to the authority to pass laws to promote and to protect the health, the morals, the welfare, and safety of the people. This authority is well established in American Supreme Court decisions, and its origins, its roots, we would say, plumb the depths of 19th century rulings. Consider, for example, that the Supreme Court said on several occasions in the early 19th century that the state police power was designed to protect the citizenry, and that meant to limit the exercise of property rights and certain liberty interests in the name of the general welfare. Here we come to grips, I think, with one of those contested principles and a contested exercise of governmental power felt deeply by our fellow Idahoans and fellow citizens across America. When I say that the Supreme Court has said since the early 19th century, and you, if you're interested, and I hope you are, you can look particularly at some very important cases, including, for example, in 1835 in Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge Company, and move forward to a long line of cases that would cite the Charles River Bridge case as precedent, you would find that the court there understands, as it happens in so many cases, the court understands that in asserting police powers, there may necessarily be a conflict with the assertion of individual rights. And we can say as a general observation that one of the great characteristics of civil rights cases or civil liberties cases is indeed that conflict between the assertion of governmental power on the one hand and the assertion of individual liberties on the other. Where both are at stake, one or the other, often both, must be taken into account, and in some ways a compromise must be found. When in fact the state legislature determines, as it did in the Charles River Bridge case in 1835, that even though there was, for example, a toll-free bridge even though, I misspoke, even though there was a bridge established by an individual, and that was the sole bridge, earning profit for the person who created that bridge. Even despite that, when the legislature determined that there was a great public interest in building a bridge that would be toll-free to better serve the interests of the citizenry, to better serve, in essence, the public interest, the Supreme Court became involved when the owner of the bridge said, well, in building this toll-free bridge, you are essentially destroying my business, and I would not have built this toll bridge if I had known that at some future date the state would grant the authority to create a toll-free bridge. Nobody's going to travel my bridge and pay a fee when they can follow the toll-free bridge. And so that became an issue of the deprivation of a property interest against the interests of the general welfare. And the Supreme Court in an opinion by Chief Justice Tawney, resolved it by saying that, in effect, the public interest must always take precedence over private interest, must always take precedence over private interest. We are, after all, part of a community. We share, by definition, general interest or public interest. And if it were otherwise, a few private individuals might be able to advance their own private interest against the public interest. That would effectively reduce the ability of Americans to enjoy the protection of their government. With this decision, then, in the Charles River Bridge case, in 1835, the court went on to further enunciate the meaning of the police power in various areas by, among other things, permitting people to create and operate gambling casinos. And then another legislature passing a law condemning casinos on the grounds that people were forfeiting their hard-earned dollars. What did that reflect? That reflected the changing perspective, the changing values of those serving in the state legislature, empowered to determine what constitutes the public interest. And so we can note here that in the exercise of the police power at various times, at different junctures, in particular decades and over the years, the exercise of the police power can do a great many things in terms of permitting gambling casinos, condemning gambling casinos, permitting the sale of alcohol, condemning the sale of alcohol. And there's a long list, because the exercise of the police power will reflect the values of the individual legislatures and their own combined sense of what best serves the larger community interest here in their states. By the 1930s, we should say, the Supreme Court, by 1941, we should say, the Supreme Court in United States versus Darby finally arrived at this conclusion, and that is that the police power of a state is coterminous with the public interest, meaning the state will always have sufficient authority to meet the needs of the people. To many, that's heartwarming. It is as it should be. To others, it sent a chill down the spine of those who were concerned that their liberty interests or their property rights, defined as their own absolute right to define their interests and to assert what they perceive to be absolute property interests or absolute liberty, was now going to be challenged and perhaps overridden by state laws. That ongoing conflict, then, in many ways, is at the root of some of the protests here in Idaho and across the nation by people who are concerned that their own rights, liberty and property rights, have been compromised by gubernatorial orders from Michigan and Wisconsin to Idaho, for example, among a great many other places. Let's try to understand what is at issue here. When, for example, the governor of Michigan, like the governor of Wisconsin, like the governor of Idaho, issued orders essentially requiring people to stay at home, and that all businesses except for essential businesses should be closed for a period of time, with the hope that by limiting interaction, by limiting mobility, that we could come to grips with the COVID crisis and stop community spread. And some people did not like those policies from the get-go. And they began to assert, among other things, that their 14th Amendment right to enjoy their property rights or their liberty rights was being compromised, that their First Amendment right to freedom of assembly was being compromised, or in the case in some states, including California, for example, that included a gubernatorial order prohibiting churches from holding services so that their congregants could meet together. People believed that their First Amendment right to religion was being compromised. So taking into account various state policies and taking into account some differences, we can say that what we have seen in the form of these protests and in some court cases is the classic conflict between the assertion of governmental power and the assertion of individual rights. And here in this case, at least, it's the classic conflict between the police power of a state and the assertion of individual liberties. What to do about this? We have seen a couple of cases. A federal court ruling, for example, in California that upheld the governor's order prohibiting congregants in a church from meeting on the rationale that if people met, then they would no doubt be more greatly exposed to the virus, or they themselves would spread the virus. And in the interest of the general welfare, the greater public interest, the governor had issued an order prohibiting the gatherings in church for a period of time. A federal judge upheld that. Or consider the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin, which struck down an order recently issued by the Director of Human Services that sought to extend the governor's order for the governor's stay-at-home order. After the governor's stay-at-home order had expired, the Secretary of Health Services imposed a very similar order for another period of time. That was challenged by the legislature, and the legislature won. In a 4-3 vote, the state Supreme Court said essentially that the Director of Health Services had failed to follow the proper path, which would have meant going to the legislature for the authority necessary to impose such an order. So we've had, in that case, that was simply an exercise of authority not grounded in the statute delegated by the legislature. And the court said if the director now wanted to issue another order, the director would have to return to the legislature. That was really just a court ruling reminding everybody about the limits on delegated authority and reminding everybody about the limits on authority, which on state police power, which is determined by the legislature. Here in Idaho, and I know many of you are interested in this, here in Idaho, when Governor Little issued his order for stay at home and prohibited all but essential businesses from opening, he was acting on the basis not of power granted to the governor necessarily, but on the basis of statutory authority. You can look at the Idaho Code in section 46, in which provides that the state legislature has delegated broad emergency powers to the governor that can reach to the regulation and the denial of the exercise of certain property interests, for example, and certain liberty interests. Once the governor declares a state of emergency, that declaration triggers very broad statutory authority delegated to the governor. And that is what Governor Little's orders have rested on since his initial order. And as you all know, I think it's this Saturday, June 1, that the governor's orders now permit our move into phase 3, which includes the opening of bars across the state, movie theaters, and a few other businesses. So when some Idahoans and some others have claimed, for example, that an order that restricted their gatherings in certain public places at parks and others on grounds that the orders violated their First Amendment rights to freedom of assembly. They certainly were acting on the basis of their accrued knowledge about the very important First Amendment right to freedom of assembly, but forgetting, I think, that as the Supreme Court has said now for some 200 years, that those liberties can be restricted by the state police power in the name of the greater public interest. And when we have a health crisis, that police power is at its greatest height. Consider, for example, in the year 1905, in a very well-known Supreme Court case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, that the pastor of a church had refused to take a vaccine after the state legislature had required all people to receive a vaccination for smallpox. And the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision written by Justice Harlan, reminded everybody that the existence of these rights enumerated in the Constitution does not mean that they're absolute rights. There's no such thing as an absolute right in our system, just as there's no such thing as an absolute power. And the assertion of rights must be construed in the context of the greater public health interest. And so Harlan's opinion, which has been embraced and invoked many times since by the Supreme Court, continues to remain good law a century or so later. So as difficult as it is for Americans to accept that the exercise of their rights are limited, it reminds us, as I said at the outset of our talk tonight, it reminds us that in a constitutional system, all governmental power is limited, all rights and liberties are limited, and what is required of the government when asserting a police power is the issuance of quote unquote reasonable regulations. The government's laws or actions could be declared unconstitutional by a court, for example, if there seems to be no reasonable linkage between the policy and the desired end. There's no rational basis, no reasonable grounds for the passage of a law or the action that would limit the interest or exercise of rights. That's the limitation on government, that its actions must be reasonably related to its objective. Here in Idaho, for example, if a court determined that Governor Little's executive order exercising his statutory authority proved to be arbitrary, not reasonably grounded, not rationally asserted, then the court could hold that the governor had exceeded his authority. But I think most Idahoans, even though there's a healthy debate, most Idahoans would agree, and I certainly would take the position that the regulations have indeed been reasonable and rational and all directed toward protecting the public from the spread of this very deadly virus. Same can be said of the assertion by plaintiffs in cases challenging the prohibition on congregants gathering in their churches when they assert a violation of freedom of religion. The denial to congregants of the opportunity to meet in their church, for example, on Sunday, is not a denial of freedom of religion. It's just the means to that end have been restricted in the interest of promoting greater public health interest. And so there's not a denial of freedom of religion. They're all still free to worship at home, to worship outside. And so there's no denial. It's just a recognition of the limitation of our rights. In a constitutional system, we should say, it would be unacceptable to embrace the assertion of unlimited governmental power, just as it would be untenable to embrace the assertion of unlimited individual liberties, whether we're talking about the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or the 14th Amendment. We seek balance, and where the lawsuits arise, typically fall into that category of whether or not the regulations imposed are arbitrary or unduly restrictive of individual rights. And in those cases, we hope that after assertive arguments and the opportunity for both sides to be heard, that the courts will render a judicious ruling, and that Americans, even if they're unhappy, will be able to say to themselves, I may disagree, but I can at least see that there is a reasonable basis behind the law, the executive action, and the court's ruling. That's what we hope to achieve in a constitutional government in a much broader context beyond the immediate issues that have given rise to some arguments and protests. As I said at the outset, we are all in this together, fighting this great pandemic, hoping that the death toll can be slowed, that we will not, in effect, have to suffer a second surge of the virus, and that Americans will be able to return to their usual activities in a very short time. I'll stop here and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Adler. Betty Ammon here, Lucky Director of the Coeur d'Alene Public Library. We do have a question that came in through our Facebook page. Do these assertions of a state of emergency have a freshness date, meaning the situation cannot be called an emergency forever?
Yes, thank you very much, Betty. That is an excellent question. The assumption behind the state law delegating authority to the governor in this case is always that the emergency will not be permanent. By definition, if an emergency becomes permanent, it no longer constitutes an emergency, but a normal state of affairs, and thus the word emergency loses all of its meaning, because an emergency connotes the idea of a departure from business as usual. It connotes a departure from that which we consider to be normal. So if in fact a gubernatorial order were imposed on the basis of this delegated authority, and it lasted months and months, anybody challenging the law, challenging the executive action, would undoubtedly come to court and say the circumstances that gave birth to the executive action and which perhaps made it reasonable at the outset no longer apply. They no longer obtain. And so the bold action taken by the governor has run its course, and it's time now to end the emergency proclamation. And just how long it would take people to make that sort of argument probably varies from individual to individual or group to group. And we all understand at some point that citizens lose their patience as they confront the economic hardships endured by the impact of an order. Certainly Governor Little is open-minded and understands that impact, just as governors in other states, Republican and Democratic alike, from Governor DeWine in Ohio who was a Republican, to Governor Whitmer in Michigan, who was a Democrat, all are keenly aware of the economic hardship endured by businesses, by individuals, and we hope, of course, that the emergency proclamation need not last an hour longer than is necessary, and certainly public pressure can voice that concern, as it has here in Idaho and other states. And we hope for a judicial balancing of the needs of the people and the conduct of their businesses versus the need for adherence to science and medical data, instructing and informing the nature and length of these proclamations.
Thank you. While we wait to see if other people have questions for you, and they can come through the library's Facebook comments page, I'd liked the terms that you used, reasonable regulation and public interest, because as a library director, those are things that it seems like every minute of every day we're thinking about here at the library, because we understand people really need their libraries. They need the access to the internet and materials, but at the same time we feel so obligated to keep people safe and to administer reasonable regulation.
Yes, I can certainly appreciate your dilemma, Betty. Your dilemma and that of your librarian colleagues across the country. All of us are interested in education. We all believe in promoting information and communication, and the libraries are at the center of those activities as well as centers of discussion and dialogue. And so I hope your patrons will exercise patience and tolerance and understanding the various measures that you've taken there at the library in order to safeguard the public. The last thing that any library would like to have said of it is that it served as a center for the transmission of communicable diseases. No library would like to have that reputation, and so that's why you and other library directors across the country have chosen to hold down the fort, act in the greater interest of the public, and provided only restrictive access, whether it is curbside delivery of books, for example, or, as I understand it, very soon, a limitation on the number of patrons who can enter the library doors at a certain time and how long that they may stay in the library. Those strike me as eminently reasonable. Gradually increasing the access of the public to the treasure trove of knowledge that is housed in the library, at the same time taking very reasonable measures to safeguard the public's health interest. So I think in many ways the library is a microcosm of the larger society. We want reasonable regulations so that we can avoid a much greater second surge and a disastrous death toll. It's reasonable. It's reasonable to act reasonably, we might say.
Well, Dr. Adler, this is David Townsend again. It doesn't look like we are getting any. Our listeners are being pretty shy. Although by my reckoning, there are more than 700 people that have at least viewed part of tonight's presentation, which is a record for attendance to the Adler lecture. We don't really have any way of knowing how many people are also watching it on the community access channel on Spectrum. Betty says we have received another question.
I'm actually refreshing the page so I can get to it. Bear with me. The internet. Another question, please. The comment is, does a gubernatorial declaration of a state of emergency open up the federal purse to the state? If so, what checks are in place to ensure that a governor does not overstate the situation in order to receive these funds?
You know, that's an excellent, very, very well-informed question as well, Betty. Thank you. And I think it certainly does provide the platform, a solid basis for the governor to reach out to the federal government to seek assistance. It's familiar to all of us who have dealt with various kinds of emergencies, not just a public health crisis, which we're confronted with now, but also in cases of wildfires that have proved devastating, or hurricanes or floods. And the governors of those states reach out to the federal government and seek federal assistance. So that's a commonplace. And in terms of governors overstepping their bounds by asking for assistance, it would be far better I think, for governors to be willing to ask for federal assistance and waiting for the federal government to determine whether a genuine emergency occurs that justifies that request, rather than a governor being shy and unwilling to seek that federal assistance when he or she believes that an emergency has justified the request, because any governor seeking that assistance can be said to be acting on behalf of his or her citizens. So I think that's a strong characteristic of governors. And as for seeking and receiving the assistance, we all know that we pay federal tax dollars, and there's a fund which is established to provide for emergencies, to meet emergencies. And just as hurricane victims in places such as Florida and New Orleans have received assistance, so too should Idahoans be willing to seek assistance in the face of any kind of an emergency. So I'm happy to have that question. It's an excellent question. And David, I'm gratified by the number of people who have tuned in this evening, and as you say, more who may be watching afterward. And I would say that it's nice to be able to come together on this occasion to understand that the questions being raised by Idahoans and Americans across the country are not merely endemic to a public health crisis, but apply to any future emergency. And sad to say, we will be confronted with other emergencies, whether they're related, for example, to climate warming or fires, floods, hurricanes, and necessary steps taken by the government at all levels to try to protect Americans. I wish it were otherwise, but I think it would be foolhardy to suppose that this is the last of the challenges or emergencies that we're going to face. And so it's a wonderful occasion created by necessity for Americans to contemplate some of these fundamental constitutional principles that we've been discussing, namely the assertion of governmental power in the face of the assertion of individual liberty. They will, as we've said, create classic civil rights and civil liberties conflicts, just as we've experienced for many, many years. We're going to continue to experience them. And it's important for Americans, I think, in the name of civic education, to have a better grasp of constitutional principles, to understand how powers are allocated, to understand the restraints on the executive, the legislature, and indeed the judiciary, and understand the scope of their rights and liberties. And I think a better understanding will lead people to participate more meaningfully, more effectively in our great system of constitutional governance.
Well, thank you, Dr. Adler, for your thoughts today. And the library is, as always, proud to be associated with you. We want to again thank our sponsors, the Friends of the Coeur d'Alene Public Library, the Coeur d'Alene Press, the Altura Institute, and CdA-TV. And with that, I think we'll bring the evening to a close. I want to remind the viewers that they will be able to see the recorded version of this lecture on both the city and library Facebook pages and on the city YouTube channel. And I believe there will probably be rebroadcast on CdA-TV in the future here. So again, Dr. Adler, thank you for sharing your time and thoughts this evening, and we wish you a very good night.
Thanks to you, David and Betty, and your colleagues, Jeff, and to the sponsors. It's good to be with you, and I hope next year we're back together in the beautiful community library in Coeur d'Alene. All of you take care, stay healthy, and be well. Good night.
We'll be looking forward to that. Thank you.